Well, as we continue our special coverage here on CPAC, we're happy to have on the program today former Prime Minister Kim Campbell. Ms. Campbell, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, you, of course, worked very closely with Mr. Mulroney, knew him truly at a level that few Canadians did. I'm wondering how you are reacting to the news of his passing.
Well, I'm in Italy, and I woke up very early this morning and saw there were a lot of texts on my phone of people sending me the news, and I felt very sad. And when I read that, in fact, he'd been in Florida to try and recuperate from some other health issues with his heart and prostate cancer, and then had a fall, I thought, oh, that's really unkind. That instead of getting better, he's been done in by a fall, which is a terrible thing that many people have a bad experience with that. So I felt sad that somehow or other that he had a few more years in him, because he's been having a very interesting, productive life. But at the same time, I also felt that it was a very historical moment, that this would be an opportunity for Canadians to take stock of a remarkable prime ministership and an extraordinary man, a complicated man. He made enemies and friends. He had fans and detractors, but you don't spend a lot of time leading in politics without creating both, because the most important thing about Brian Mulroney is that he did things and did big things, and so he was a larger than life person, and I was very proud to be in his government.
Larger than life, as you say, and certainly there is much to talk about when we reflect on Brian Mulroney. But I actually want to begin with your own relationship with him, because you were elected to Parliament in the 1988 vote. That was the beginning of Mr. Mulroney's second term. And I believe up until that point, you had actually not met Mr. Mulroney yet. No. What were your impressions of him at the time? What made you think that this was a man with whom you wanted to work alongside with?
Well, I was nominated for the 1988 campaign after the writ had already dropped. Pat Carney was the member of Parliament for Vancouver Centre, and she had announced she wasn't running again, and they still didn't have a candidate. And she was convinced that I was the only one who could actually hold the riding for the Progressive Conservatives. And I kept saying, no. And then finally, I agreed that I would resign my seat in the legislature and run. But I said to Pat, I don't know Prime Minister Mulroney. Tell me about him. And she said, well, I guess I can sum him up in two ways. One, he's an Irish family man. And two, he always comes down on the right side of an issue. And I thought that was very interesting. And actually, I've never had any reason to think that she wasn't quite accurate, because his devotion to his family and the importance of that to him was a really important underpinning of everything he did. And he could see that the things that you did in government affected real flesh and blood human beings. And I think he doted on his wonderful wife, who was an extraordinary partner for him, and loved his kids. But I think also when it came to difficult issues, he came down on what were, for me, mostly the right side. And I think what was interesting about him was that he was willing to change his mind. When we think about free trade was the issue of the 1988 election. In fact, that was one of the reasons why I was interested in running, because I had realized it was going to be a very divisive campaign, and I supported the free trade agreement largely through what I had learned in my time working as a staffer for Premier Bill Bennett. And I thought it was important, and I knew it was going to be hard. But what's interesting about Brian Mulroney is that, like many people, he had a kind of a knee-jerk view of free trade, that, we couldn't have free trade with the United States because they were so much bigger. Although actually, when you examine free trade relationships between countries of disproportionate sizes, the smaller country usually gets the biggest benefit because it gets access to a much bigger market, etc. So when the MacDonald-Royal Commission reported out in 1985, this was a commission that had been struck by Pierre Trudeau and was chaired by a Liberal finance minister, but it brought together some of the leading experts in the Canadian economy and polity, and for a very in-depth review and study of Canada's economic life and political life, and really a blue ribbon writ large panel of people. And when they recommended that we should enter into negotiations for a free trade agreement with the United States, Brian Mulroney respected that recommendation, certainly as something that was well-founded. And on thinking about it and learning about it, he decided that that is what he should do. But what was important was that he was willing to change his mind. He didn't take a kind of knee-jerk reaction, I've always thought it couldn't happen. He was willing to learn and willing to say, there are people who've studied this issue much more deeply than I have, and they think we should do this. And you saw this in quite a number of the issues. For example, acid rain. What did Brian Mulroney know about acid rain? He was totally indifferent. It wasn't something that was on his playbook at all when he came into federal politics. But one of his MPs, Stan Darling from Muskoka, was very concerned about acid rain and the effect it was having on the forests of Ontario and eastern Canada and the northern eastern United States. And he just, I was joking, he put his teeth in Brian Mulroney's ankle and wouldn't let go. And you have to think about this, you have to do something. And finally, Brian did. And what he found was that what Stan Darling was talking about was, in fact, absolutely true. That we were, experiencing very serious environmental damage from acid rain. And out of that came the Acid Rain Treaty, which was also, in many ways, a reflection of something else that I think is important about him. And that was his understanding. Well, first of all, he was a personally very charming man, and he loved nothing more than to amuse you and to tell stories and, entertain people. But he also understood, I think he and Mila both understood, that personal charm and personal relationships were a very important tool for building the kind of trust that you need to get people to support you. And so when, they were meeting with other leaders and the whole thing with President Reagan and the Shamrock Summit and blah, 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 all of that was designed to create the kind of personal friendship that would then be good for Canada. And I remember remarking in my memoir that Brian and Mila were the first couple I'd ever met who were sort of what I would call professionally charming. I'd worked for Bill Bennett, and he and his wife were very nice, but they didn't see that as a particular way of enhancing the effectiveness of their government. Mm-hmm. And Brian and Mila did. But why they were so good at it was because they genuinely liked people. They were very people. They were very gregarious. They enjoyed people. They had talent. Mila was wonderful. She could always find something interesting to say. She was very real and authentic. And if you talked to her, she wouldn't just give you the kind of, baffle gab. She would say something real and charming and observant and interesting. And as a result, they built relationships of admiration and affection among many key political leaders in the world. So that when Brian Mulroney wanted something to happen, like an acid rain treaty with the United States, he could call Ronald Reagan, who was predisposed to do something for him. Mm-hmm. That there was that friendship and that trust. So it was a very interesting mix of very good, sophisticated political calculation that use the natural skills and bonhomie and also the desire to entertain people well with elegance and show Canada off, at its very best. Yeah. So that was a very interesting mix, and in quite a number of those issues, and you've probably read the famous story about the close call with the free trade agreement when the Americans didn't want the dispute resolution mechanism, and Derek Burney calls the Prime Minister and says it's going to fail because they won't accept it, and Brian calls Jim Baker, the American, I guess he was the Secretary of State then, and says, I think I'm going to call the president. I'm going to ask him one question. Why are you creating a nuclear arms control agreement with your worst enemy, and you won't create a free trade agreement with your best friend, Canada? And so James Baker said, I'll call you back in 30 minutes, and ran off, and they got it. But it was all because Jim Baker knew that if Brian Mulroney called the president, the chances are he was going to get what he wanted. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just because it was a good argument for Canada. It was that extra dimension of trust that came from building a personal relationship, mutually supporting and helping. And it was a pretty magical combination of skills. Now, a lot of people thought he was too smooth, but, if I could paraphrase Barry Goldwater, smoothness in the pursuit of good things for Canada is no vice.
Well, and I'm quickly running out of time, but I do have a couple more questions for you here, because I do want to ask, when you talk about this personal investment that Brian Mulroney had in people, the fact that he did authentically like people, including members of his own government, his own caucus, I'm wondering if that type of investment ever helped you out in a tough time.
Well, I wasn't that close to him, but there was one funny story, and I told it earlier today to someone else, that when my marriage broke up while I was in government, my husband at the time, Howard, he did not want to be a political husband. And when Brian learned that Howard and I had separated, he called me at home, and to say he was concerned about this, and I guess he wondered how what the impact of it would be on my political career if I didn't have a husband. And then he said, "Do you want me to phone him?" I said, no. But that was so like him, maybe I could phone him and talk some sense into him and whatever. And the funny thing was that my then husband thought that I was doing what I should be doing. He thought I was, great doing what I was doing. He just didn't want to be part of it. But it was so funny that Brian, his way of trying to be helpful was to offer to be a marriage counselor. But I have to say I declined those particular skills. Although God only knows, heaven knows what would have happened if I said, yeah, why not?
My closing question here, because of course, to this day, you remain the only woman to ever hold the top office in this country. And in 1993, when you ran for the conservative leadership, progressive conservative leadership, you said that Brian Mulroney had helped open the door for women in public life and public office. I was wondering if you could expand on that and share why you believed that at the time and perhaps still do.
Well, because they traditionally, and I talked to women who served in the Pierre Trudeau government, whatever, sometimes the prime ministers will do it on sufferance because they feel they have to. And they give you positions that they think are not going to, they're going to be, a lot of hard work and difficult problems to solve, but they're not going to be very glamorous. Brian Mulroney, appointed Barbara McDougall, the first woman in a finance portfolio. She was the assistant minister, or the junior minister of finance, but that was a big deal to put a woman in a finance portfolio. And, our current finance minister is the first woman ever to hold the whole thing on her own, Christopher Freeland. So it was a big deal when you think about how long ago that was. But when he named me Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, that was a big deal. And it was a big deal because the issues that you deal with in justice, there are a lot of gender dynamics there. And I convened a national symposium on women law and the administration of justice with his support to begin to start a conversation about ways in which women felt that the justice system didn't serve them. So not only was I, as a woman, there in that important portfolio, and 7 of my predecessors had in fact gone on to be prime minister, but he put me in a position where I could do things for women. And although I was the first woman to be Minister of National Defense, I wasn't the first woman in a defense portfolio because Mary Collins was the Associate Minister of Defense. I didn't have an associate. She was Associate Minister to Marcel Mass, and she introduced a whole lot of interesting programs about gender and the role of women in the Canadian military and gender bias and gender discrimination and all of these things. So it wasn't just that he put women in the window to do things, but he put women in positions where they could actually advance the causes of women, where they could look deeply into some of the issues of public policy and public administration and the operation of things like the military, and see whether gender fairness was being done there and whether there were policy changes that needed to be made. So I think that was really very important. And I think that I remember when I became Minister of Justice going home to Vancouver and total strangers would come up to you on the street. They thought this was a really significant quantum leap forward for women because that was a portfolio that no woman had ever held before. So when you do those things, you do get a chance to redefine who gets to do them. And of course, there have been other women, Anne McClellan and Jody Wilson-Raybould, who held the justice portfolio. But he, because I have to tell you, there were a lot of talented men in our caucus who would have loved to have been justice minister. And he was able, he took a chance on me, and I knew that it wasn't because I was the only one who could do it. It was because he wanted to make that change, and I think I lived up to his trust because I think I was able to do a lot of very good things and pass a lot of good legislation and difficult issues in that portfolio. But having his support was important, and that was a quantum leap in women establishing their ability to be effective legislators and leaders in the government of Canada. And there have been many others as well, but that was, in his government, it was important. And then, of course, Barbara McDougall, who became foreign minister. Mind you, Flora McDonald had been foreign minister with Joe Clark, but Barbara, had that portfolio. So there were a lot of ways in which women were front and center in the non-traditional portfolios that weren't the ones that women usually got to hold.
Kim Campbell, I so appreciate the time today. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks. It's an important moment to kind of rethink some of our history. So thank you for asking me.